I really love arcade games from the late 70s going into the early 80s. That's the period sometimes considered the golden age. I say sometimes because somebody might dispute that. Anyways, I love these games. Namco, Atari, Konami, Midway, Williams Electronics, Taito, you name it. All the good stuff. This whole world of retro games was something of an early special interest of mine, and I've been fascinated by these arcade games for a multitude of reasons, whether it's the games themselves or their physical presentation. I mean, literally, the physical presentation. A whole ass cabinet? A table? Look at this! Now you're really talking. Come on, bring that back. We used to be a world, a proper world. I was born in 1992, so I missed that very golden age. And of course, there was the infamous North American video game crash of 1983, and the eventual rise of the home console game. However, arcades were still around when I was a kid growing up in the late 1990s and into the early aughts. In fact, they're still around now. They're just not as common, of course. The cinema where I work, interestingly, has one. It used to have a Namco collection machine too, but they got rid of it. Boo! But I feel like when I was at least 10 years old, circa 2002 going into 2003, at least one place had a retro video game in it. One of my local diners had a Ms. Pac-Man machine for a little while, and other restaurants and bowling alleys and such had that Class of 81 arcade machine that contained both Ms. Pac-Man and Galaga on it. And if you entered the secret code, the original Pac-Man. I remember my second ever trip to Walt Disney World. I was staying at the Boardwalk Resort, and they used to have a video arcade. I made sure I visited that. I just remember saying to some random staffer, because, I don't know, I wanted to brag or something about stuff I knew. Like, oh yeah, did you know you could get Pac-Man on this machine? I was 12 at the time. I was a little shit. Anyways, I would like to think that this fascination of mine blossomed from a few different things, in a rather unusual way or two. And my love for these games, I suspect, is for equally unusual reasons. In other words, buckle up, we're getting autistic up in here. First, I'd like to highlight my rather roundabout introduction to these sorts of games growing up in the late 1990s. It wasn't through a compilation like Namco Museum, nor even a trip to the arcade. It was a collection of MS-DOS games I had as a kid. So, growing up in the late 90s, we had an MS-DOS computer, and, to my understanding, the MS-DOS computers were going out of style by the mid-90s. But we had one well into like the year 2000 or something. Yeah, we were really riding into the new millennium strong, weren't we? I believe this computer was used at where my mother and stepfather used to work, back in the day. I guess it was a computer that they didn't need anymore once they updated to the latest Windows computers or whatever, so they were like, you can take that one home with you so your kids can play with it. Yeah, that's how it happened. And yeah, my sister and I played with this MS-DOS all the time, because we had a bunch of floppy disk shareware games and programs, which I loved. A lot of them were presented in similarly simplistic and rudimentary graphics, even though these were games that came out past, say, 1985 and looked like they could have debuted sometime before the NES. Speaking of which, we had a hand-me-down NES that we played quite a bit, and the games did play a part in my dive into retro games. But something about those DOS games, I recall playing those a lot more back then. I mostly remember playing my NES when I was much younger, in the mid-90s. The MS-DOS games span from around that time to the year 2000, so those were more my exposure to old-school graphics in the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 age than the NES was. I only remember playing a handful of NES games circa 1996, such as Duck Hunt, Home Alone 2, and Monopoly, off the top of my head. Some of my MS-DOS favorites included Hugo's House of Horrors, its threequel, Jungle of Doom. I recall having the floppy for the second Hugo game, Whodunit, but I don't remember ever playing Whodunit back then for some reason. I really dug those games, a lot. Hugo's House of Horrors legit freaked me out as a wee one. That frickin' dog. Ah! We also had Commander Keen 2, Crystal Caves, Ski Free.
Oh, this fucking guy!
Some of these games were demos, not the complete games, but we still had a lot of fun with them. Just sitting at the computer, sitting at that old wooden desk in what we called the family room by the back deck door. Maybe a plant next to it. Ah, please take me back. Sometimes I found a way to write little things in various programs. Little text documents, little stories. I think I typed my first ever story on my DOS, actually. In like 1997 or whatever, where the fledgling writer got their start. It was some random story about a girl who has this disgusting concoction of a sandwich that she really didn't want to eat. And then did. Yeah, don't ask. I couldn't tell you what that was all about either. We also had some educational programs, one of which was called Google Math Games. Not Google, Google. Like many classic MS-DOS games, this one's unarchived, thankfully, so that tells you it exists. I had the hardest time trying to find it when I was doing a Google search of a Google Math Games. What the hell was that called? Though most of the copies of Google I've seen floating around have an all-blue background, the one we had was an earlier version with a black background and the various assets were like green, purple, pink, etc. Very cosmic looking, like you were at the spaceship's computer or something. Looking out into an undefined destination out in the cosmos, deeper into space than you imagined. Speaking of space, New Math Blaster Plus was also in our possession. Also among our little educational games was Amy's First Primer, the developer of which created it as a teaching tool for his pre-K daughter in 1987. This too had gameplay that was often against a solid black or blue background, and it had activities like an alphabet, loading shapes onto a truck, helping a frog get to the end of a maze, all sorts of stuff. Again, all on top of a blue or black background. Much like many Golden Age arcade games, circa 1978 to 1983. I experienced that type of visual style, well past the age where that style was new and revolutionary. MS-DOS games and some of my NES sessions were more or less my introduction to that whole era of games. Even after I had gotten my PlayStation in Christmas 1998 and played the Nintendo 64 if it was at someone else's house, I still really liked the relatively crude-looking DOS games I had. My Hugos and Crystal Caveses and Word Rescues. There were various elements that drew me in, even if they didn't have such up-to-date graphics and such dynamic gameplay. They were like an almost minimalist, sometimes surreal alternative to my Test Drive 5s and Crash Bandicoots. Something about that look and presentation, as a kid, really drew me in, and it continues to fascinate me to this day. And that's what a lot of arcade games circa 1981 were like. Black or solid color backgrounds, bright colors, your Space Invaders types, your Pac-Mans, your Berserks, your Centipedes. Oh yeah, speaking of Space Invaders, tons and tons of space games. Perfect match. I think I last used my MS-DOS computer in 2000 or so. It had to have been around the end of the second grade. For whatever reason, the computer was out of the picture. Perhaps it broke. I don't know. But I do vividly remember having it in my bedroom for a period of time, circa 1999. And sometime in 2003, I began developing a sort of nostalgia for those games. Nostalgia? At age 10? The hell was wrong with me? This was spurred by A, getting a Game Boy Advance, which included Super Mario Advance 2, the collection including a great port of 1990's Super Mario World and a spruced up version of the 1983 Mario Bros. Arcade game. B, during winter, every middle of the week, my dad and I went to my local community pool, and afterwards we'd get a bite to eat at the nearby diner. In their vestibule was that aforementioned Miss Pac-Man cabinet. I remember usually getting the Texas French toast for dinner and getting an occasional whirl on the Miss Pac-Man machine. Those are some fairly fond memories of mine from a not great time in my life. And it was like, this was just like my MS-DOS games from a few years ago. I miss those. Anyways, yeah, I was aware of Pac-Man as a kid too, but mostly what he was by the late 1990s, a 3D sphere with a face, dressed in gloves and boots. I was not aware of his original 1980 arcade debut. In fact, I largely knew about Pac-Man through a Pac-Man clone for the MS-DOS called CD Man. Somehow, somebody made this game and managed to not have Namco come after them. This was like my exposure to Pac-Man, and I remember distinctly calling the game Pac-Man, and I think that's simply because someone in my house called it Pac-Man. Whoever was playing it with me or helping me boot it up probably said, "Oh yeah, this is Pac-Man. Wanna play Pac-Man?" I don't remember it ever being called CD Man, and for years it kinda plagued me. Wait, wasn't there a Pac-Man game for MS-DOS? But instead of ghosts, it had spiders, and it was kind of in a graveyard-like setting? Oh, that was CD Man. Okay, would never guess that. With the Miss Pac-Man machine and the two Mario games, I learned that these games were older. Mario World was 1990, and the arcade games were from the early 1980s. And that blew my mind, like, wow, Pac-Man is from 1980? Things being from the past always fascinated me. It's one of my weird little things. All that said, this love of these kinds of games grew little by little. Where it really got going was in Christmas 2003. I got an Xbox, a Namco plug-and-play, and one of those Famiclone aberrations that had 84 NES games / bootlegs, and also had 10 of its own bizarre games built in that I one day discovered by accident when I dislodged the cartridge from the weird Nintendo 64 mishmash controller. This menu. Look at this menu right here. Forget 42. That's life, the universe, and everything right there. These plug-and-plays were perfect for my Namco Museum deprived ass, though I later got that compilation for Xbox like a couple of months later. But no, really, these plug-and-plays gave me hours of endless fun, both being my education in video game history circa winter 2004. And I suppose that was the same for a lot of other kids out there too. And what do? I do some research. I head to websites like System16 and Clov, Killer List of Video Games. Really dating myself there with those. It all became a full-blown special interest. And then I started getting all those arcade collections that were out at the time. Namco Museum and Midway Arcade Treasures for the Xbox, Konami Arcade Advanced and Pac-Man Collection for the GBA, and Atari Anniversary Edition for the PC. Some of these games even had behind-the-scenes features on them, and little interviews with the creators. They were like little encyclopedias. They don't do that with arcade collections these days. Like, what gives? I got books on the subject even. This fellow was studying up, I tell ya. Maybe that explains my poor grades at the time. By the end of the year and into the next, it all solidified. Nowadays, the more I look at these games, which continue to be favorites of mine, the more it's clear to me that these games are like an intersection of many different and specific things that I love. But I connect with them in a certain way that may or may not make sense, so here goes. So one of the strange reasons I love these games, the void. At an early age, playing those MS-DOS games, sometimes it was in the evening, night even, parked in that dark corner of the room, affixed on the visuals while someone had TV on in the background and the lights were off. Well, sometimes. Those are some of the vivid memories I have. Most of my computer time was at night, given that I was in school all day, and on the weekends, I was elsewhere. I was going on adventures all around the state. What do you want from me? When playing some of these games, it's like I got lost in the solid color backgrounds, transported into them, in a way, in some surreal void. I think over time, I came to associate those simpler designs and backgrounds with these strange spaces where anything can happen. A dream space, a playground for the abstract, an almost indescribable feeling. Perhaps that was partially fueled by those scenes in animated films and shows where it was never-ending oddities and surrealism, like the pink elephants on parade sequence in Dumbo, or the sort of minimalist void an old production company logo inadvertently creates. This is a kind of surrealism, whether intentional or not, that continues to draw me in, even in my 30s. It was very cool to me as a kid circa 1998, and it's equally cool for me now. It gives me a lot to chew on. And sometimes, there was very little sound in these voids as well. It could create a possibly uneasy feeling, or it could really immerse you into its dreamlike world just the same. The sounds, from the iconic jingles and themes to the unique effects, all kinds of fun things going on here. Given that these weren't full-fledged scores, that just adds to the unique minimalism. And from there, you get a sort of surrealist, almost cosmic dream fantasy. And a lot of the concepts were cartoonish or fantastical in some way. Pac-Man, Q*bert, Donkey Kong, Frogger, Crystal Castles, Mappy, Dig Dug, Pengo, and games like those lean more on the cartoon side with plenty of bizarre little touches, more in line with something on a Saturday morning, or even a Golden Age of Hollywood era animated short. I mean, heck, Nintendo eventually adapted Popeye. They wanted to adapt Popeye into a game but couldn't. We got Donkey Kong instead. And then after the success of Donkey Kong, we got the Popeye game. And those certainly weren't strangers to these kinds of visuals. Hell, Don Bluth and his crew literally brought that kind of magic in another way to the arcade with their work on Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. Straight up interactive cartoons. And fantastical and sci-fi flavored ones at that. You also had Saturday morning adaptations of some of these games in the form of Hanna-Barbera's Pac-Man and Ruby Spears' Saturday Supercade, whereas games like Warlords, Wizard of War, Satan's Hollow, Joust, those are a little less cartoony in presentation, much more akin to epic fantasy novel front covers and comics, but still somewhat inhabiting that sort of abstract dream space. Joust, for example, with its almost mythical desert setting. Thy game is over. The jousters atop ostriches, hands coming out of the lava, pterodactyls, holy shit, those jump scare pterodactyls! A game like Centipede is somewhere in between, I feel. A bit on the colorful and cartoony side like a Pac-Man type, but also having some of that epic fantasy vibe to it as well. What even is the scenario in Centipede? A snakehead taking on this giant centipede and equally big bugs in this Alice in Wonderlandian mushroom field? Oh, the colors and black background alone make this a sort of prime example of what I'm talking about here. In Millipede, you appear to be a person this time, taking on bugs in a sort of medieval fantasy like Incredible Shrinking Man scenario. All going wrong in the garden. On that note, I often now tend to associate these games with the surrealism and psychedelic pop culture of the late 60s and early 70s, one of my favorite avenues in music. And it wasn't only the music, it was also the pop artwork on album covers, posters, advertising, etc. Basically, retro games like that are interactive blacklight posters from the late 60s and early 70s. Change my mind. At first glance, Pac-Man is just a colorful, cute maze game where you munch dots and avoid ghosts. Or it can be seen as a gluttonous fever dream, and the paranormal is involved for some reason. You're stuck in an endless, repeating bright maze, a source of light in the stark black void, eating like there's no tomorrow, staring down the dead, like you're at the end of some late-stage... Oh, okay, you're probably completely lost. I'm sorry about that. That absolutely was not, as far as I know, designer Toru Iwatani's intentions with a mere game he designed to appeal to female players in a sea of pew-pew space shooters. What I'm saying is, when you have a weird-ass brain like mine, you start to create little ideas of what these simplistic games can be, far beyond what their creators intended them to be, almost like they're a canvas to paint those more abstract ideas onto. Hey, if that recent Pac-Man interpretation can exist, why can't mine? Of course, as game graphics got more defined, this sort of went away, as these sorts of choices were mostly down to limitations in what the developers and programmers can do and couldn't do. But in a weird way, they created something out of those solid colored backgrounds and simpler renderings. It's as if the concept they had, such as a cartoon character eating dots in a maze, or a bear collecting gems in castles, or even a carpenter taking on a big ape, was interpreted by a surrealist working with some minimalism, with the aesthetics of the late 60s not too far behind them, albeit with a pixelated coating. Going back to those more epic fantasy type games, even the more grounded in reality types, factor in the cabinet art for a lot of these games, and I feel they line up quite beautifully with that kind of art from the 60s. Especially all those album covers, similar fonts, etc. Like one of these album covers from, say, 1967 to 1969 could have easily been the side art to an Atari or Namco game, to these eyes at least. Ditto a blacklight poster like these, yet meeting with the then new tech of that age. And it's not just fantastical and surreal blacklight posters and album covers, but plenty of other things, in addition to a lot of these games being like an intersection of those aforementioned late 60s aesthetics and the accompanying music scene. There's also the science fiction genre and space elements, a huge part of this era of video games. There were so many space games made during this period, and given that a lot of these games had those solid backgrounds, it was ideal for the setting. While the space age of the 1960s was over, that spirit is still in these games and their cabinet artwork, but married to a contemporary post-Star Wars sort of cosmic wonder, and it's where many of the sci-fi and fantasy concepts went hand in hand. Taito's Space Invaders came out in 1978 and really redefined what an arcade video game could be, after years of Pong clones and much more simplistic ideas. The game took inspiration from plenty of then-new sci-fi and space fantasy works, Star Wars being a given, along with the classic anime Space Battleship Yamato. It dipped even further back to earlier sci-fi staples, namely H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Coincidentally, that same year, War of the Worlds got an amazing prog rock musical album adaptation from Jeff Wayne, and a real powerhouse combo of rock musicians. Definitely check that out if you haven't. Some machines of Space Invaders had artwork that could be seen below the game itself, but if you were playing it without that, there was only a black background, and several bright aliens. Of course, a year later, Namco's Galaxian would build on this formula and have sparkly, starry backgrounds.
Oh, wait. Are they? They're flying at me. Oh my god, they're flying at me. Oh no. Oh, there's a formation. Oh no, what do I do?
Anyways, something like Galaxian was a notable leap ahead in presenting a cosmic fight with extraterrestrials. Galaga would take that even further in 1981, setting the stage for more to expand upon. But looking past that, Space Invaders in its original form can be seen, at least to these weird eyes, as a slow, feverish, non-chaotic, dreamlike scenario. Aliens march down in a formation, but not hastily. All you hear are those gradually descending notes, while you move left or right, and shoot. It's not like an all-over-the-place Star Wars-esque action scene. Now, combine that with the minimalist shapes and colors, the all-black background, and yeah, it hits different for some reason, even in the 2020s. It's fun to paint a larger picture like that with less. The Galaxian and Galaga duology are a legendary aesthetic meeting of the sci-fi motifs, and because of the then new hardware capabilities, the late 60s has colors and blacklight posters surrealism. Look at the logos even. They look like something Roger Dean would have designed. He did several logos and album covers for rock groups in the progressive and hard rock spheres throughout the 1970s. Yes, Uriah Heep, Gentle Giant, Budgie, O.C. Bisa, the like. He's legendary for his many influential sci-fi paintings, which have inspired films like Avatar and such. Avatar's literally just the Roger Dean movie. All those floating islands, like, come on. Oh, and he also did cover art for various video games, mainly published by Psygnosis. He designed their owl logo, too. It's giving Rush's Fly-By-Night, honestly. It's kind of unusual in that these late 70s, early 80s games wore a lot of stuff that I associate with the previous decade, even though they are of a period that I associate mainly with new wave music and synths and neon and sleekness, in a much different pop cultural landscape at that. Drawing on past influences and combining them with brand new ideas to usher in something exciting beyond what was seen in the games of the early to mid 1970s. There's a hidden unique quality to those early arcade games that goes beyond just nostalgia and the novelty of something being old and pixelated. These games immersed me in ways a much more realistic game simply cannot, and without those limitations, with such visual choices had even been made back then.
He's a good boy. Who's a good girl? Yes, you are. Who's a good girl?